I'm going to share some data this afternoon from the annual digital news report, which has been referred to a couple of times already, and also from some of the focus groups that we've done in the last year about some of these issues about the future of the media. And probably the first thing to say is that news brands, not everyone's getting their news from social media. News brands still matter, so our research shows that even in Greece, 72% of people that we poll say that they get the news either online or in print from a weekly newspaper, from a newspaper of some kind, and 94% still tune in to television news at least once a week. So broadcast and traditional media still matter. These things are true, but they mask these enormous problems that we've been talking about this morning for the news industry and also for consumers too. So I'm not quite sure how I move this on. There we go. So in terms of sort of key challenges, I think there are kind of three really. So firstly, everyone's been talking about the funding challenge, so the decline in newspaper sales, newspaper ad revenue as well, the problems in digital advertising from ad fraud to ad blocking, and then you have intermediaries such as Google and Facebook taking significant amounts of the revenue. I think the second issue is abundance. Again, that word has been used already today. So we've gone from a world of scarcity to one where news is ubiquitous. And that sort of oversupply, particularly of general news, means that the perceived value amongst consumers has gone down. And that leads us on to the third problem, which is one of trust. So consumers on the web, and again, people have referred to it this morning, find it increasingly difficult to separate out what is reliable information from news that is fake or biased or just poorly sourced. And then that's been exacerbated by the fact that the economic problems means that many publishers have chosen to chase clicks rather than quality, and that has increased the sort of cycle, if you like, of distrust. So this chart has been referred to already in the previous panel. This was basically a survey, what trust looks like across countries. On average, less than half of us say we trust news most of the time across the 36 countries we look at. In some countries, a little bit more. So countries like Finland, where they still have trust in institutions, 62% at the top. But then at the bottom, you have Greece, 23%. So in Greece, every single age demographic distrusts the news more than they trust the news. And then you see the US sort of fairly low down in terms of general news, but this issue of polarization that we've also referred to, people who use Fox News on the one hand or MSNBC on the other hand trust much more those sources. So you see this big gap between general trust, which is a sign of polarization and some of that sort of fragmentation, partisan trend that we've been talking about. And then in terms of fake news, this is actually a chart, so we've heard a lot about fake news. It's a deeply inadequate term, as many people have described already, but this looks at it from an audience point of view and tries to separate out the different elements that audiences tell us in focus groups that they're talking about in terms of whether they understand the information environment. And you do have some of that false news, more in some countries than others, in terms of people trying to manipulate political information or making money. But the sort of bulk of what people talk about in focus groups is actually related to journalism in some way. So either superficial journalism, mistakes, the fact that there's been dumbing down on the one hand, or spin and propaganda, either from politicians or from journalistic outlets that have a point of view and have an agenda, or from advertising that looks like it's news. These are the things that consumers really care about. And so that the news itself, as you can see here, it is associated with sort of professionalism. It's part of a sort of, there are things that the news industry can do about in those three elements, and there are things that platforms are going to be responsible for in terms of sorting out some of the false news that is primarily pushed around through those platforms. So just to sort of reinforce that point in terms of some of the key drivers of mistrust, what people tell us is that much of that is to do with how journalists behave. So presenters, for example, presenting themselves, promoting themselves rather than giving the facts, for example. So the sort of rise of celebrity journalism. The New York Times were talking about this. The fact that facts are not separated out sufficiently from opinion quite often. So most news these days is sort of speculation, a user comment there. The chasing of clicks, so this is about being first, is really important on the internet, and so that's led to a decline in journalistic standards as well. And then this is a really interesting one, particularly for young people, sort of a concern about the negativity of the press, and in many ways that is turning people off the news. One of the most shocking stats for me in the last report, so 43% trust, as I say, but 29% say that they are avoiding the news, often or sometimes. And in Greece, that figure is over 50%, so they sometimes or often avoid the news. And the reasons for that are negativity, so that actually they feel that the news is so depressing that they don't want to be part of it, but also that they can't rely on the news to be true. And that relates to the partisanship that I was talking about earlier. And that individually people feel that they can't necessarily do anything about it themselves as well, so that sense of powerlessness. What about the business models? So I've talked about the funding, and that's, I think, the heart of what this panel is about. What are we seeing there? So there is a shift going on, I think. I think we are, and we're going to talk about this, I think there's a real shift away from relying on advertising, which has led us to the position we're in to some extent, to more reader revenue. And many of the people we talked to in our annual survey at the beginning of the year say that they are going to be relying less on advertising. So 62% of our digital leaders, we spoke to about 200 at the beginning of the year, said they were going to rely less on digital advertising, and 10% are planning a future with no digital display advertising at all. So what are they doing instead? So maybe, the key is diversification and a diversification of revenue sources. But a lot of people are putting up paywalls and trying to charge for news. What we find is across all countries, only a relatively small percentage are prepared to do that. So about 13% if you average it across all countries. But if you look specifically, there's big variation. So on the one hand, you have a few countries, richer countries, that have subscription traditions, like Norway and Sweden, for example, 26%. But countries like Greece and the UK, where there's very little tradition of that, right down at the bottom. So I think this will be a long slog for many people. It's not going to be a panacea, though it's very much flavor of the month right now. There are some green shoots. So this whole sort of fake news debate, on the one hand, is it going to return people to quality, or is it going to mean that everyone distrusts the news even more? And what we find in the States, at least, is the whole Trump phenomenon, the whole fake news phenomenon, has led some people to return to quality. So for the first time, we've seen a big increase in the last year in the percentage of people prepared to pay for news. You've heard from the New York Times already. They've doubled their subscription numbers, so they've added almost 1 million subscriptions since the election, Wall Street Journal, etc. So there are some green shoots. Much of that is driven politically, so people on the left essentially supporting newspapers they think are going to hold Donald Trump to account, and by young people, by the under 35s, which I think is a real sign of hope, actually. It's not true that young people are not prepared to pay for news. So finally, reinvent or fail. I've talked a lot about the problems, but what about solutions? Maybe we'll discuss this in the panel. And I think there are sort of I think it is a critical moment for the news industry for all the reasons that we've said. And the heart of it, I think, is trust. The media needs to rebuild trust in its core product. It needs to go back to basics, and it needs to differentiate what is good journalism, again, from just information that is swimming about there in social networks. And part of that is getting rid of and dealing with these issues of gender and bias, which are the core reasons for mistrust. Secondly, obviously find those sustainable funding models. And there won't be one, there will be a range. And models that don't drive quality down, like digital display advertising has, but drive quality back up again and support independence. Thirdly, I think this is kind of related, but it's about building longer-term relationships. Pavlos was talking about fragmentation, and how do we rebuild that sense of connection between brands, because you're not going to make money if you're just constantly chasing quick fixes. And then, I haven't talked much about this, but the younger generation are really different in their habits. You have to engage young people completely differently. Those who are turning off the news And that will involve different agendas, it will involve different staffing, and it will involve a more positive agenda, I think, that is being demanded by the young. They are interested in news, but they're not necessarily interested in the news that we're giving them right now. Thank you.